40 feet down a sheer cliff face, with a flood-swollen river roaring below, a lone German shepherd clung to life. Trapped, exhausted, and terrified, its only hope was the man preparing a rope far above, a veteran who had spent years hiding from the world. For a man who had walled himself off from everything, this was an act that made no sense. But as he leaned back over the abyss, the veteran saw more than just an animal in distress. He saw a reflection in its desperate eyes, a ghost from a past he could never outrun. Could saving this one life be the first step towards saving himself? Or would the ghosts of his past pull them both into the void? Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in Havenwood, Texas, had a weight to it. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that smothered sound under the vast, searing sky. For Bruce Bennett, that silence was both a refuge and a prison. His small ranch, tucked away in the rolling expanse of the hill country, was a fortress against a world that no longer made sense. The world had become too loud, too fast, too full of ghosts. Bruce was a man carved from the leftovers of a war. At 40 years old, his tall frame was leaner than it had been in his Marine days, but still held a wiry strength. His short brown hair was surrendering to gray at the temples, a distinguished silver that contrasted with the weariness in his kind, blue eyes. A thick but neatly trimmed beard covered the hard line of his jaw, hiding the tension he perpetually carried there. He moved with a purpose that was ingrained, every action deliberate, from mending a fence line to brewing his morning coffee. It was a discipline that kept the chaos at bay. His days were a repeating loop of solitary chores. The cattle didn't ask questions, the dry earth didn't flinch from his gaze. It was a life whittled down to the bare essentials, a penance for a debt he felt he could never repay, a debt that was sealed in the dust of the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan back in 2015, a debt owed to Vincent. This afternoon, the routine was broken. The pantry was nearly bare, and the silence of his own home was starting to echo the emptiness inside him. He needed supplies. The thought of driving into town sent a familiar, cold spike of anxiety through his gut. Havenwood was barely a town, just a single main street with a grocery store, a gas station, and a diner. But even that was too much sometimes. Still, he went. He pulled on a faded navy blue plaid shirt over a gray t-shirt, his worn denim jeans, and the sturdy work boots that were a second skin. The drive in his old Ford truck was a familiar one, the winding road flanked by live oaks and limestone outcrops. He kept his eyes on the road, forcing his mind to stay blank, to not drift to other markets, other crowded places, filled with noise and smells and threats that were no longer there but felt like they were. He pulled into the parking lot of Miller's General Store. Through the windshield, he could see the mundane choreography of small-town life. People chatting by their cars, children laughing, the automatic doors sliding open and shut. It was normal. It was safe. But his heart hammered against his ribs as if he were approaching a hostile compound. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The calm chatter of the parking lot warped in his ears, blurring into the chaotic din of a Kandahar bazaar. The glint of sunlight off a car bumper became the flash of something sinister. His breath grew shallow. He was supposed to go inside, buy coffee, bread and beef, and then leave. It was a simple mission. But his body refused to obey. The four walls of the truck felt like the only safe place in the world. After a long minute, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the dust on his temple, he put the truck in reverse. The mission was a failure. He drove home, the silence in the cab now filled with the loud hum of his own shame. Back at the ranch, the sky seemed to reflect his dark mood. The brilliant, unforgiving blue of the Texas afternoon was being consumed by bruised-looking clouds rolling in from the west. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. A storm was coming, not a gentle spring shower, but a violent, angry tempest. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, hitting the tin roof of his porch like thrown pebbles. Within minutes, it was a deluge. The wind howled, a mournful sound that rose to a furious shriek, tearing at the old oaks and whipping the rain into horizontal sheets. Bruce moved methodically, securing the cattle in the barn, latching gates, and checking the storm shutters on the house. He had seen storms like this before. He knew what the Pedernales River was capable of. For hours, the storm raged. The world outside his windows was a churning chaos of wind and water. The power went out, plunging the house into a deep twilight gloom, lit only by the strobing spectral flashes of lightning. The river, normally a gentle, meandering presence at the edge of his property, was now a roaring monster. He could hear its deep guttural anger even over the scream of the wind. It was the sound of nature's fury, raw and untamed. Just as dawn approached, the storm broke. The wind died down to a whisper, and the torrential rain softened to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. The silence that returned was profound, a vacuum left behind by the storm's violence. Bruce stepped out onto his porch and stared at a world remade. The landscape was battered and submerged, fields were now lakes, and his driveway was a muddy stream. But the most terrifying change was the river. It had breached its banks by at least 50 yards, a vast churning sea of brown water carrying trees, fence posts, and unrecognizable debris downstream. He spent the morning assessing the damage. The barn had held, the cattle were safe, but his fences were gone, and a section of his land was simply washed away. As he stood on a high point overlooking the canyon, where the river cut deep into the limestone, the stillness of the aftermath felt eerie. The air was clean, washed by the rain, but the devastation was absolute. It was in that immense, desolate quiet that he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, or a trick of his own mind. But then it came again, faint and thin. A bark. It was weak, desperate, and almost swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. It was a sound of life in a world that felt dead. Bruce froze, his entire body on high alert. A dog. Somewhere down in that mess of floodwater and rock. The sound, fragile as it was, cut through him like a knife. It plunged him back a decade to the suffocating heat of a C-130, the smell of jet fuel and nervous sweat, and the easy smile of Corporal Vincent Hayes. Vincent, who could calm the most ferocious animal with a soft word and a steady hand. Vincent and his partner. Rex, a magnificent male German shepherd, sable-colored, with intelligent amber eyes that missed nothing. He was a military working dog, fiercely loyal to Vincent and a vital part of their unit. Bruce could still see him so clearly, the way he moved with fluid grace, the way his ears would perk at the slightest sound. Rex was courage and loyalty given canine form. The bark, faint as it was, carried the ghost of Rex on the wind. It was a sound of distress, the same sound Rex had made in his final moments, a sound that had haunted Bruce's sleep for 10 long years. Another bark, weaker this time. A plea. Without a second thought, Bruce turned and headed back toward the house. He didn't know what he would find down there, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not going to leave a soldier behind. Not again. The desperate bark gave Bruce a direction, a focal point in the sprawling chaos of the flood's aftermath. The hesitation that had paralyzed him in the grocery store parking lot was gone, replaced by the sharp, clear focus of a man with a mission. He moved with an economy of motion he hadn't felt in years, his boots sinking into the slick red-brown mud as he navigated the treacherous terrain toward the canyon's edge. The world had been scoured clean, the familiar paths erased, but the sound was his beacon. He followed the rim of the canyon, his eyes scanning the sheer limestone walls below. The Pedernales River still churned violently at the bottom, a muddy torrent that had ripped the landscape apart. He saw where entire sections of the cliff had sheared off, leaving raw, pale scars in the rock. And then he saw him. On a narrow ledge, perhaps 40 feet down, was a dog. It was a German shepherd, its magnificent coat of gray and white so caked with mud that it blended into the stone. It stood on a precarious shelf no wider than a park bench, the only patch of solid ground in a vertical world of danger. Below it, the floodwaters licked at the rock, and above it, the overhang offered no escape. The path that might have once led to the ledge was completely gone, a testament to the river's immense power. The dog was utterly, hopelessly trapped. It let out another bark as it saw him, a sound that was less a warning and more a weary, heartbreaking plea. It was a mature adult, lean and powerful, even in its exhausted state, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Its body was trembling from cold, fear, or both. It wasn't aggressive, it was a survivor, cornered by a catastrophe it couldn't comprehend. Bruce's assessment was instant and clinical. No approach from the river, no path down the cliff face. The only way to the dog was from the top. The only way was down a rope. A cold knot formed in his stomach, a mixture of the old fear and a new, galvanizing purpose. He gave the dog one last look, a silent promise, and turned back toward the house. In the back of his hall closet, behind old coats and a box of things that belonged to a life he no longer lived, was a heavy canvas duffel bag. It smelled of dust and mildew, a scent of abandoned intentions. He pulled it out into the light. Inside was a complete set of professional climbing gear, a static rope, a harness, carabiners, and a rappel device, all of it practically new. He had bought it all a few years after he came home on the advice of a therapist who suggested finding a hobby that would force him to focus, to trust himself and his equipment. He'd thought that maybe, by confronting a physical fear, he could conquer the formless ones that haunted his mind. He went out once, set up an anchor, and stared over the edge of a cliff, the same ghosts from the Kandahar Bazaar swirling in his vision. He had packed the gear away that afternoon and had not touched it since. It was a monument to another failed attempt at becoming whole. Now it would have a purpose. He carried the bag back to the canyon's edge, his movements once again sure and steady. He bypassed the smaller, younger trees near the precipice and found what he was looking for about 30 feet back, a massive, ancient live oak, its roots sunk deep into the Texas soil for centuries. It had withstood 1,000 storms. It would withstand one more. He worked with a quiet efficiency that was pure muscle memory. He slung the anchor strap around the thick, sturdy trunk, cinching it tight. He checked the stitching, the tension. He threaded the long, kernmantle rope through the rappel ring, found the center point, and tossed both ends over the cliff's edge. They uncoiled in the air, twin lifelines of woven nylon snaking down the rock face. He put on the harness, the familiar feel of the leg loops and waist belt, a strange comfort. He clipped the rappel device onto the rope and then onto his harness, double-checking every connection, every gate, every lock. There was no room for error. The part of his brain that worried about crowds and loud noises went silent. This he understood. This was about procedure, trust in the gear, and a clear objective. The dog watched his every move from below, its barks having subsided into low, anxious whines. "Easy now," Bruce called down, his voice calm and even, careful not to project any alarm. "Just hold on, I'm coming to get you." He backed toward the edge, the rope taut, his weight settling into the harness. For a moment, he was suspended there, the solid ground behind him, the empty air before him. He took a breath, pushed off, and began his descent. The dog erupted into a frenzy of panicked barking as his boots scraped against the limestone wall. It was a cornered animal, and a man was now descending upon it from the sky. It flattened its body against the back of the ledge, its lips pulling back to reveal a flash of white teeth in a defensive snarl. Bruce ignored the display of fear. He did not stop. He did not make any sudden movements. He kept the descent smooth and controlled, his gloved hands feeding the rope through the device, his boots finding purchase on the slick rock. He continued to speak in a low monotone, the words themselves less important than the soothing, steady rhythm. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. Just easy now. Easy, boy." He was 20 feet down. The dog was still snarling, but its barking had become less frantic, more uncertain. It could see he wasn't a threat. He wasn't aggressive. He was focused, and his focus was not on the dog, but on the rope, the wall, the process. He was 10 feet down. The snarling stopped. The dog's ears, which had been pinned back in fear, now flickered forward with curiosity. He was 5 feet above the ledge now, hanging in the air directly in front of the animal. He stopped his descent, holding himself steady. He didn't reach out. He didn't try to get closer. He simply remained there, a quiet presence on the rope. The dog tilted its head. The fear in its eyes, deep and primal, was slowly being replaced by something else. An intelligent, calculating assessment. It looked at Bruce, at the rope that held him, at the anchor far above. Its body was still tense, coiled like a spring, but the overt panic had passed. The frantic, cornered animal was gone, and in its place was a keen observer, watching, waiting, and wondering what this strange, quiet man was going to do next. A silent truce was struck in the air between them, a fragile understanding hanging on a lifeline between the sky and the raging water below. For a long moment, man and dog simply existed in that vertical space, separated by 5 feet of air. Bruce hung on the rope, his breathing controlled, while the German shepherd watched from its stone prison, its intelligent eyes tracking his every slight movement. The initial, frantic fear had been replaced by a tense, waiting stillness. Slowly, Bruce let out more rope, lowering himself until his boots touched the outer edge of the narrow ledge. He kept his body angled away, making himself as non-threatening as possible. The dog pressed itself further against the rock wall, a low rumble starting deep in its chest, but it did not snarl. "Easy," Bruce repeated, the word a soft puff of air. "I'm just here to help." He unclipped a length of wide nylon webbing from his harness, a runner he would use to create a makeshift sling. He remembered Vincent's voice from a long-ago training exercise, calm and clear. "The tone is everything, Bennett. They know your intent before you even move." Bruce held the sling out in one hand, letting the dog see it, smell it. He spoke again, using a simple command he had heard Vincent use 100 times. "Stay." The dog's ear twitched. It knew the word. The low rumble in its chest subsided, though its body remained rigid with tension. Bruce took it as a sign. He moved with painstaking slowness, one fluid motion, and looped the webbing over the dog's head and under its chest, behind its front legs. The animal flinched, but allowed the contact, its warm, damp fur brushing against Bruce's cold hands. He clipped the ends of the sling together with a carabiner, then attached it securely to his own harness. They were connected. "Okay, buddy," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "Time to go up." The ascent was a brutal, grueling affair. It was no longer a controlled descent, but a raw fight against gravity. Bruce had to haul not only his own weight, but the 90 pounds of dead, exhausted animal now hanging from his harness. He used ascenders to grip the rope, his legs braced against the wet limestone, his arms straining to pull them upward, inch by painstaking inch. His muscles, long unused to this specific strain, screamed in protest. The burn in his shoulders was immense, and his thighs quivered with the effort. The dog seemed to understand what was happening. It made no move to struggle, hanging passively in the sling, its body occasionally bumping against the rock face with a soft thud. With every foot they gained, Bruce's breath came in ragged, burning gasps. The physical exertion was all-consuming, a fire that burned away the ghosts of the grocery store, the whispers of the bazaar. There was no room for anxiety here, no space for anything but the rope, the rock, and the weight of the life he was pulling toward the sky. After an eternity that was likely only 15 minutes, his hand finally closed over the rocky lip of the canyon's edge. With a final guttural heave, he dragged himself and his cargo over the top, collapsing onto the damp earth in a tangle of rope and limbs. For a long time, they both just lay there, gasping for air. The dog gave a full-body shudder, then licked at its front paw, which was bleeding from a sharp cut. It looked at Bruce, its amber eyes holding a look of profound weariness, but the fear was gone. They had survived something together. The trek back to the house was slow. The dog was favoring its back leg and limping badly on its cut paw. Bruce walked beside it, his hand hovering near its back, ready to steady the animal if it stumbled. It was during that slow, muddy walk that he gave the dog a name. He was a phantom, an apparition that had appeared from the fury of the flood. More than that, he was a living specter from Bruce's own past. "Ghost," Bruce said aloud. The dog's ears perked at the sound of his voice. The name felt right. Back at the ranch, Bruce led the dog not to the barn, but into the warmth of his small house. He laid out an old clean blanket on the floor of the living room, and Ghost, after a moment of hesitation, limped over and collapsed onto it with a heavy sigh. Bruce retrieved his old medic kit. He worked gently, cleaning the cuts on the dog's paws with antiseptic. He examined the swollen back leg, his touch professional and sure. Ghost watched him the entire time, occasionally letting out a low whine when a wound was touched, but he never pulled away. He submitted to the care with a quiet dignity that spoke of discipline and a history of trusting human hands. When he was finished, Bruce sat back on his heels. The adrenaline of the rescue had faded, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in his bones. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sound of another living creature's breathing, and that was when the pain hit him. It wasn't a physical pain, but a deep, hollow ache in his chest. Every time he looked at Ghost, he saw Rex. He saw the proud set of his head, the alert posture of his ears, the sable and tan coat replaced by gray and white, but the spirit was the same. The quiet intelligence in those amber eyes was a mirror of the ones that had looked to Vincent with absolute devotion. Having Ghost in his house was like inviting a memory to come and sit by his fire. It was a comfort, a tangible presence that pushed back against the crushing loneliness. But it was also a constant, agonizing reminder of what he had lost, of who he had lost. The image of Vincent, smiling, giving him a thumbs up just before that final patrol, flashed in his mind as sharp and clear as if it were yesterday. And with it came the suffocating weight of his own failure. He couldn't stand it. He stood up and walked out to the front porch, leaving Ghost resting on the blanket. He needed air. He needed the familiar solitude of the Texas twilight. He sat down heavily in his old wooden rocking chair, staring out at the ravaged landscape as the sky bled from orange to deep purple. He was fine on his own. He was better on his own. He didn't need another connection, another potential loss. The screen door creaked open behind him. Bruce didn't have to look to know who it was. Ghost limped out onto the porch, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the wood. He walked over to Bruce's chair and stood there for a moment, his warm breath fogging in the cooling air. Bruce kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight. Then he felt a gentle, heavy pressure on his knee. Ghost had laid his head on Bruce's lap. He wasn't demanding anything, not asking for food or attention. He was just there, a silent, solid presence in the growing darkness. Bruce's entire body went rigid. His first instinct was to pull away, to push the dog off, to retreat back into the safety of his emotional fortress. A wave of grief for Vincent, for Rex, washed over him, so powerful it almost stole his breath. But then he felt the dog's soft sigh, a puff of warm air against the denim of his jeans. It was a sigh of trust, of contentment. Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, Bruce raised his hand. It hovered in the air for a second, trembling slightly, before he lowered it onto Ghost's head. The fur was thick and soft beneath his calloused fingers. He felt the strong bones of the skull, the gentle twitch of an ear. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, his hand resting on the dog's head as the last of the light faded from the sky. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't entirely alone. The new day dawned soft and clear, the sky washed clean by the storm. A tentative peace had settled over the ranch, mirroring the fragile truce that had formed between its two inhabitants. When Bruce woke on the couch, where he had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, the first thing he saw were two amber eyes watching him from the blanket on the floor. Ghost didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his presence was a quiet, undeniable fact in the morning light. A new routine began. Bruce made coffee, his movements still stiff and sore from the previous day's exertions. Ghost followed him at a distance, limping softly, his tail giving a single, uncertain wag when Bruce glanced his way. Bruce put out a bowl of fresh water, which the dog drank gratefully, and a plate of scrambled eggs, which he devoured in seconds. An unspoken understanding was taking shape between them. It was not friendship, not yet. It was a shared survival, a mutual respect between two solitary beings who had found themselves on the same patch of solid ground after a flood. But while their world was one of quiet gestures, the world outside had begun to talk. At the Crossroads Diner, the only place in Havenwood to get a decent cup of coffee and the town's daily supply of news, the story of Bruce Bennett's rescue was the main topic of conversation. The small restaurant was humming with its usual morning crowd of ranchers in dusty boots and town workers on their break. Martha, the diner's owner, and a woman who had run the place for 30 years, refilled coffee mugs as she listened to the story being retold for the 10th time. "Hanging 40 feet down that cliff," a rancher named Dale said, shaking his head in disbelief. "After the way the Pedernales was running, that boy's got more nerve than sense." "He was always a quiet one, even before he went overseas," Martha added, wiping down the counter. "Barely said 2 words. Since he came back from the service, he's been like a ghost himself. It's good to see him, well, doing something." Sitting in a booth by the window, a man listened to the chatter, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee mug. This was Mr. Charles, the founder and sole full-time operator of Havenwood Paws, the local animal rescue. He was a man in his late 50s, with a face weathered by the Texas sun and a lifetime of hard work. His hands, resting on the ceramic mug, were calloused and capable, the hands of a man used to building fences and gentling frightened animals. But there was a deep-seated sadness in his eyes, a permanent shadow that the morning sun couldn't touch. He had been listening with professional interest, his heart swelling with a familiar admiration for the bravery of both the rescuer and the animal. But when Dale mentioned the breed, the atmosphere in his small booth seemed to change. "A big German shepherd from the sound of it," Dale said, "just appeared out of nowhere." Charles's hand tightened on his mug. The casual conversation suddenly became sharp, personal. A cold, familiar dread coiled in his stomach. German shepherd, stray, unknown history. The words were like alarm bells ringing in his mind. He could almost feel a phantom pain, a memory of a child's scream and the sight of blood. He pushed the half-finished coffee away, the bitter taste suddenly unbearable. He knew what he had to do. His responsibility wasn't just to the animals in his care, it was to the people of this town, to the children. He had failed to protect his own once. He would not fail again. He stood up, left a few dollars on the table, and walked out of the diner, the cheerful chatter fading behind him. His old pickup truck, a faded green model with the Havenwood Paws logo on the door, was parked outside. As he drove out of town and toward the rural road that led to Bruce's ranch, his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was acting out of a fear so old and so deep, it felt like a part of his own soul. He found Bruce outside, checking a section of fence that had been torn down by the flood. Ghost was nearby, lying in a patch of sun, his head on his paws, but his eyes were alert, tracking Bruce's every move. The dog saw Charles's truck first, his ears perking up, a low, almost inaudible growl rumbling in his chest. Bruce turned, his posture immediately wary as the truck pulled to a stop. He did not invite visitors. Charles got out, closing the door softly. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice calm and polite. "My name is Charles. I run the animal rescue here in town." Bruce just nodded, his expression unreadable. "I heard what you did yesterday," Charles continued, gesturing vaguely toward the canyon. "That was a brave thing, a remarkable thing. You saved that animal's life." "I did what anyone would have done," Bruce said, his voice flat. "No, sir, not everyone," Charles corrected gently. "Which is why I'm here. An animal that's been through a trauma like that, a stray with no known history. It can be unpredictable." He looked pointedly at Ghost, who had risen to his feet and was now standing silently beside Bruce, a furry gray shadow. "He's not a stray," Bruce said, his voice dropping an octave. "He's with me." "For now," Charles agreed, "but large breeds, especially shepherds, they have powerful instincts. If they're scared, they can be dangerous. I've seen it happen. It only takes a second. A child wanders onto your property, a stranger approaches too quickly." He let the sentence hang in the air, thick with unspoken tragedy. "All I'm saying is that the responsible thing, the safest thing for everyone, including him, is to let me take him in. We have a proper facility at Havenwood Paws. We can evaluate him, give him medical care, try to find his owners." Bruce looked down at Ghost, who leaned almost imperceptibly against his leg. He had spent the last 10 years pushing the world away, and in less than 24 hours, this animal had breached his defenses. He had pulled the dog from a cliff, and in doing so, had pulled himself out of his own suffocating stillness. The thought of handing him over, of sending him to a cage, of being alone again in the heavy silence, was unthinkable. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Charles," Bruce said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But he's not going anywhere." Charles's kind eyes hardened with a deep, sorrowful resolve. He saw a man in denial, a man making a dangerous mistake. He saw the powerful dog standing guard, and his old fears screamed that he was right. "I hope you reconsider, son," he said, his voice filled with a genuine paternal worry that Bruce found more infuriating than any threat. "Some things can't be undone once they happen." He turned and got back into his truck, leaving Bruce and Ghost standing in the quiet of the morning. A line had been drawn. The silent sanctuary Bruce had built for himself had been breached, and the world, with all its good intentions and painful memories, was demanding a say in the life he had just saved. The confrontation with Mr. Charles left a residue of unease that clung to the rest of the day. A fragile peace had been disturbed, and the outside world, which Bruce had so carefully kept at a distance, now felt like it was pressing in on him. As evening fell, he went through his chores mechanically, his mind replaying the conversation. He saw the deep, fearful conviction in Charles's eyes and felt a familiar frustration. How could he explain the connection he felt to this dog? How could he explain that Ghost's presence felt less like a danger and more like a quiet atonement? He ate a silent dinner, sharing scraps of grilled chicken with Ghost, who ate with a polite restraint that was at odds with a starving stray. Later, they sat on the porch as they had the night before, but the comfortable silence was gone. Bruce's mind was a landscape of old battlefields, and the quiet of the Texas night did little to soothe him. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no escape. It dragged him back to the place he spent his waking hours trying to forget. He was in the Korangal Valley, Afghanistan. The year was 2015. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the rocky terrain. The air was thin and tasted of dust and diesel. He was on patrol, the heavy weight of his gear a familiar burden, the reassuring presence of his unit around him. Ahead of him was Corporal Vincent Hayes, younger, his face not yet etched with the permanent weariness of war, his smile easy and genuine. And at Vincent's side, moving with the focused grace of a perfectly honed weapon, was Rex. The dream shifted, the memory fracturing into the chaos of a nightmare. The crack of a single rifle shot, sharp and definitive, echoed through the valley. Then came the storm. The air erupted with the deafening chatter of automatic fire. Shouts. The metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He was behind a rock, the ground vibrating with impacts. He was shouting orders, his voice raw, trying to make sense of the ambush. The nightmare sharpened its focus on a single, horrific image. Vincent was down. He wasn't moving. Rex was standing over him, a sable-colored guardian, barking with a fury that defied the storm of bullets around him, trying to protect his fallen handler. Bruce remembered the feeling of utter helplessness, a paralysis of will as he was pinned down, unable to advance, unable to reach them. The world became a tunnel of noise and dust and the desperate fading sound of Rex's barks. Bruce jolted awake, a strangled cry caught in his throat. He was sitting bolt upright in his bed, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. His sheets were soaked with sweat. For a terrifying, disorienting moment, he was still there, in the choking dust of the valley, the phantom smell of cordite in his nostrils. His hands flew up to defend himself from an enemy that wasn't there. Then, a wet nose pressed insistently against his clenched fist. A low, soft whine cut through the ringing in his ears. He blinked, his vision slowly clearing. He wasn't in the korangal. He was in his bedroom. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting the wooden floor in pale silver. And sitting beside his bed, looking up at him with an expression of intense concern, was Ghost. The dog whined again, a gentle, questioning sound, and nudged his hand once more. The simple, physical contact was an anchor. It was real. Bruce focused on the sensation, the cool, damp nose, the soft fur, the solid presence of the animal beside him. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. The bedroom slowly came back into focus. The phantom sounds of battle faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets outside. He was safe. He was home. He looked down at Ghost, and the dog's calm, unwavering gaze was so full of a strange understanding that it unlocked the memory the nightmare had only hinted at. The door in his mind he had kept bolted for a decade was suddenly blown wide open, and the past came flooding through, not as a chaotic dream, but as a clear, complete, and devastating recollection. He remembered the morning of that patrol, the easy banter between him and Vincent. They had been friends since basic training, their bond forged in shared hardship and relentless gallows humor. Vincent was the heart of their unit, the one who could always find a reason to smile. His greatest love, besides his high school sweetheart back home, was Rex. The memory showed them resting before the final push, Vincent carefully brushing the dust from Rex's thick sable coat. "Gotta look sharp for the ladies, right, boy?" Vincent had murmured, and Rex had responded by licking his handler's face, his tail thumping a happy rhythm against the dirt. Bruce had watched them, a small smile on his face. The trust between them was absolute, a perfect, unspoken partnership. Then came the ambush. In the clear, cruel light of memory, Bruce saw his own mistake. He had given the order to advance around a rocky outcrop, believing the area was clear. It was his call. Vincent, always the first to move, had led the way. The first shot came from a sniper hidden high in the rocks. It was a perfect shot. Vincent went down without a sound. The memory played out in agonizing slow motion. Rex's immediate, instinctive move to shield Vincent's body. Bruce's desperate, futile attempts to lay down suppressive fire. He remembered screaming into the radio, his voice cracking as he watched his best friend bleed out in the dust, protected only by his loyal canine, both of them impossibly, tragically out of reach. He had failed them. He was the sergeant. They were his responsibility. He had led them into a trap, and Vincent had paid the price. The memory finally released him, leaving him sitting on the edge of his bed, trembling in the quiet of his room. The grief was as raw and immediate as it had been on the medevac helicopter 10 years ago. It was a physical weight, a crushing stone of guilt that had been sitting on his chest for a decade. He wasn't aware he was crying until a hot tear splashed onto his hand. He made a choked, gasping sound, the first sob he had allowed himself since the day he'd stood at Vincent's funeral in his dress blues. Ghost, who had been sitting patiently, seemed to sense the shift. The wave of silent, overwhelming sorrow that was pouring off of Bruce was a signal. He stood up, moved closer, and pushed his head firmly into Bruce's side, leaning his full weight against him. He didn't lick. He didn't whine. He just stood there, a solid, warm, living brace in the darkness. The action was so specific, so unnervingly familiar, that it struck Bruce like a physical blow. It was exactly what Rex used to do. After a tense patrol or a firefight, Vincent would sit on his cot, his hands shaking slightly, and Rex would come and lean against him, just like this, offering his quiet strength until the trembling stopped. Seeing that same gesture now from this ghost of a dog who had appeared in his life out of nowhere was the final undoing. The carefully constructed walls Bruce had built around his heart for 10 years, the fortress of solitude and silence, crumbled into dust. A raw, ragged sob tore from his throat, and he wrapped his arms around Ghost's thick neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. He wept. He wept for Vincent. He wept for Rex. He wept for the young man he had been, the one who had died in the dust of that valley alongside his friend. Through it all, Ghost stood perfectly still, a steadfast anchor in a storm of grief, absorbing the tears and the pain, and offering nothing in return but his silent, unwavering presence. Something shifted in the house after that night. The raw, ragged edges of Bruce's grief had been exposed to the air, and in that vulnerability, a new kind of quiet settled between him and Ghost. It was no longer a silence of isolation, but one of comfortable, shared space. The emotional dam within Bruce had been breached, and while the grief had not vanished, it no longer had the same suffocating power. A little light was getting in. In the days that followed, a new dynamic took shape. Bruce started talking to Ghost, not in long conversations, but in the short, clipped phrases of a man unaccustomed to speaking his thoughts aloud. "Let's check the fences, boy." "Dinner time." "Good dog." Ghost, in turn, became his constant shadow, following him on his rounds, his limp noticeably improving, his tail now offering a slow, steady wag whenever Bruce looked his way. It was during these quiet days of work and companionship that Bruce began to see the true nature of the animal he had rescued. His military eye, trained to observe detail and assess capability, started noticing things. One afternoon in the barn, while trying to loosen a rusted bolt, Bruce's wrench slipped and clattered loudly onto the concrete floor. Ghost, who had been dozing in a sliver of sunlight, was on his feet in a microsecond. But he wasn't panicked or barking wildly. He stood in a perfect, alert guard stance, his body rigid, his ears forward, his eyes scanning the barn entrance. He was assessing the threat, not reacting blindly to the noise. It was the calm, disciplined posture of a trained professional. Curious, Bruce began to test him. One evening, as he was putting his tools away, he looked at Ghost and said in a clear, firm voice, "Sit." Without hesitation, Ghost sat. His form was perfect, his back straight, his attention locked on Bruce. A moment later, Bruce tried another command he had seen Vincent use thousands of times. "Stay." He turned and walked away, across the yard and toward the porch. He stopped and looked back. Ghost had not moved a muscle. He was a gray and white statue, his gaze still fixed on Bruce, patiently waiting for the release command. A lump formed in Bruce's throat. This was not the behavior of an ordinary stray. This was the result of hours, months, years of dedicated, professional training. Ghost was a soldier of some kind, just like him. The mystery of where he had come from deepened, and with it, so did the bond Bruce felt toward him. The true test of that discipline, however, was yet to come. The flood had destroyed nearly half a mile of his property's northern fence line, leaving his land exposed. It was a long, arduous job to fix it, requiring him to spend most of the day far from the house, hauling posts and stretching wire under the hot Texas sun. He left the back door of the house propped open so Ghost could go in and out for water and shade. He had no concerns about leaving the dog alone. Ghost had instinctively assumed the role of guardian of the homestead. Bruce was wrestling with a stubborn fence post, his back to the house, the only sounds the creak of his post puller and the buzz of cicadas in the heat. He was completely absorbed in his work, his world narrowed to the fence, the wire, and the sweat dripping into his eyes. Back at the house, the afternoon was still and hot. Ghost lay on the cool linoleum floor of the kitchen, dozing lightly. A western diamondback rattlesnake, thick as a man's arm and nearly 5 feet long, slithered from the cool darkness beneath the old woodpile at the edge of the yard. Its movements were slow, unhurried, its patterned scales a perfect camouflage against the dry earth. Driven by thirst and the search for shade, It moved silently toward the inviting darkness of the open back door. Ghost sensed it before he saw it. A subtle shift in the air, a scent that was alien and dangerous. He lifted his head, his nose twitching, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. He rose to his feet without a sound and padded to the doorway, his body low to the ground. He saw the snake now, its distinctive diamond pattern clear in the sunlight, its forked tongue tasting the air as it advanced. Every instinct in a normal dog would have screamed to attack, to rush the intruder. But Ghost did not attack. His training, whatever it had been, took absolute control. His body went rigid, a statue of focused intensity. He planted his feet firmly in the doorway, creating a living barrier between the snake and the house. And then he began to bark. It was not the excited, happy bark of greeting, nor the low growl of warning he had given Mr. Charles. This was something else entirely. It was a sharp, percussive, and rhythmic alarm. A series of 3 short, sharp barks, followed by a pause, then repeated. Bark, 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 pause, bark, bark, bark. It was a code, a signal. It was a sound designed to cut through the noise of the world and communicate one thing: critical danger. Half a mile away, Bruce heard it. He paused, his hand on the fence post, and tilted his head. At first he dismissed it, but the sound came again, sharp, urgent, and unnervingly consistent. It was not the sound of a dog chasing a squirrel. It was the sound of an alarm being raised. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through him. Vincent had taught him to recognize the different barks of a canine. This was an alert, a serious one. He dropped his tools and ran. He sprinted across the uneven field, his heart pounding against his ribs, his mind racing through a dozen terrible possibilities. An intruder. Mr. Charles coming back to take the dog. An accident. He vaulted the small creek bed and scrambled up the rise toward the house, the rhythmic barking growing louder, more urgent. He rounded the corner of the house and skidded to a stop, the scene laid out before him like a frozen tableau. There was Ghost, planted in the doorway, his body a rigid wall of fur and muscle, barking his rhythmic alarm. And there, coiled in the dust about 10 feet away, was the rattlesnake, its tail a blur of motion, its head raised, ready to strike. It was a deadly standoff. Bruce's mind went silent and clear. He grabbed the long-handled garden hoe that was leaning against the house, his movements swift and sure. He circled wide, coming up behind the snake to draw its attention. The snake, sensing the new, larger threat, swiveled its head toward him, its rattle now a furious, buzzing roar. In one swift, powerful motion, Bruce brought the blade of the hoe down, ending the threat instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. The rattling stopped. The barking stopped. Ghost immediately broke his stance and rushed to Bruce's side, whining and nudging his hand, his body trembling with leftover adrenaline. Bruce dropped the hoe and knelt, his own hands shaking. He ran his hands all over Ghost's body, checking for bites, for any sign of injury. The dog was unharmed. He had held his ground, had kept the danger at bay, but had been smart enough, disciplined enough, not to engage. Relief washed over Bruce, so powerful it made him dizzy. He wrapped his arms around Ghost's neck and held him close. The dog responded by licking his face, a frantic, loving gesture. In that moment, everything became clear. Mr. Charles had warned him about the dangers of an unpredictable stray, but this dog was the opposite of unpredictable. He was disciplined, intelligent, and fiercely protective. He had not just acted as a companion, he had performed a duty. He had guarded his post. He saw the situation with a clarity that cut through all the grief and confusion. Ghost wasn't a reminder of his failure to save Rex. He was a second chance, a chance to protect one of his own. He stood up, his hand resting on Ghost's head, and looked toward the town. His decision, which had been an emotional, instinctive thing, was now forged into something hard and unbreakable. Ghost was not just a dog he had found. He was his partner. He was home, and Bruce would not let anyone take him away. News, like water, follows the path of least resistance, and in a small town like Havenwood, that path was the gossip mill. The story of the rattlesnake, an event Bruce saw as a testament to Ghost's discipline, underwent a transformation as it was passed from one person to the next. By the time it reached the ears of those who frequented the feed store and the post office, the details had warped. A disciplined standoff became a vicious fight. A protective bark became a frenzied attack. The quiet heroism of the act was lost, replaced by the thrilling specter of violence. It was this distorted version of the story that found its way to Mr. Charles. A mother dropping off a donation of old blankets at Havenwood Paws mentioned it with a worried tremor in her voice. "Did you hear about that stray Bennett is keeping? I heard it went mad and killed a huge rattlesnake right in his yard. What if a child had been there?" For Charles, those words were like a match thrown on dry tinder. His deepest fears, born from a single horrific afternoon years ago, roared back to life. He saw not a protective dog, but a predator, its instincts for violence now confirmed. His earlier warnings had been ignored, and now the animal was exhibiting aggressive behavior. In his mind, the line had been crossed. This was no longer a matter of opinion, it was a matter of public safety. His hands trembled as he thanked the woman, his face a grim mask of resolve. He would not stand by and wait for tragedy to strike again. That afternoon, he walked into the office of the Gillespie County Sheriff. He stood before the front desk, his hat in his hands, and formally filed a complaint. He reported that a resident, Bruce Bennett, was harboring an unregistered, potentially dangerous animal that had exhibited aggressive behavior, citing the rattlesnake incident as proof. He did so with a heavy heart, believing he was performing a necessary, albeit unpleasant, civic duty. The complaint landed on the desk of Sheriff Brad. Brad was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same limestone and live oak as the hill country itself. He was in his late 50s with a full head of steel-gray hair, a deeply lined face, and a calm, steady gaze that had seen just about every kind of trouble a small Texas county could produce. He had known Bruce's father, and he knew Bruce as the quiet, withdrawn young man who had gone off to war and come back a shadow of his former self. He also knew Charles and the deep, private grief he carried. He understood the ghosts that haunted both men. Brad read the complaint with a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. This was the last thing he wanted to deal with. It was a hornet's nest of old wounds and stubborn pride. But a formal complaint required a formal response. The law was the law. He picked up his keys. The sight of the sheriff's cruiser rolling up his long, dusty driveway sent a jolt of cold apprehension through Bruce. He was outside, brushing Ghost's thick coat, a simple act of care that had become part of their new routine. Ghost sensed the change in him instantly, his body stiffening, his ears perking toward the approaching vehicle. To Bruce's surprise, a second truck, the faded green pickup from Havenwood Paws, pulled in right behind the cruiser. Sheriff Brad got out, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a big man, but he didn't use his size to intimidate. Mr. Charles got out of his own truck, his face etched with a worried determination. "Afternoon, Bruce," Brad said, his voice a low, calm rumble. Ghost let out a single, low growl, and Bruce put a hand on his back, silencing him. "Sheriff," Bruce acknowledged, his tone clipped. He nodded curtly at Charles. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Brad began, getting straight to the point. "But I've received a formal complaint regarding your dog. I'm obligated to investigate. Mr. Charles is here to state his concerns directly." Charles stepped forward, his expression earnest. "Bruce, I told you I was worried. Now I hear the dog got into a violent fight with a rattlesnake. That is exactly the kind of unpredictable aggression I was talking about. It's a predator, and its instincts are taking over. What happens next time when it isn't a snake?" Bruce's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger rising, hot and fast. "You heard wrong," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There was no fight. There was a snake. Ghost found it before it could get in the house. He cornered it, and he sounded an alert. He didn't attack it. He stood his ground and called for me. He did exactly what a trained dog is supposed to do." "A trained dog?" Charles scoffed, though without malice. "He's a stray, son. You don't know what kind of training he's had, if any. What you see as discipline, I see as a ticking clock. Today, he corners a snake. Tomorrow, he corners the mailman or a child who wanders up your driveway. He would never. Bruce started, but Charles cut him off. You don't know that. The words burst out of Charles, his composure finally cracking, revealing the raw fear beneath. You can't know that. I've seen what dogs like him can do. I've seen the damage. It only takes one mistake, one bad moment, and a life is changed forever. I will not stand by and let that happen in this town again. The three of them stood in a tense triangle in the afternoon sun. Bruce, rigid with a protective fury, his hand never leaving Ghost's back. Charles, his hands clenched, his face pale with the memory of a long-ago horror. And Sheriff Brad, standing between them, a man of the law caught in a conflict that had little to do with laws and everything to do with pain. Ghost, at the center of it all, remained perfectly still. He seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. He didn't growl or bark. He simply stood beside the man who had saved him, a silent, living testament to the bond they shared, his amber eyes moving between the three men with a quiet, unnerving intelligence. Finally, Sheriff Brad held up a hand. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't getting us anywhere. Charles, I understand your concern for the community's safety. It's my concern too. And Bruce, I hear what you're saying. I'm looking at the dog right now, and I don't see a vicious animal." He took a step closer, his gaze softening as he looked at Ghost, then back at Bruce. He saw the way the man and the dog stood together, a small, defiant unit against the world. He saw two survivors. "But a complaint has been filed," he continued, his tone becoming official again. "And I can't ignore it. We are not going to solve this by shouting at each other in your yard. We need to find a way forward that respects the law, but also respects the situation here." He paused, looking from one stubborn face to the other. "We're at a stalemate. So here is what I believe we need to do." Sheriff Brad stood between the two men, a human buffer in a field of invisible minds. "Here is what I believe we need to do," he started, his voice resonating with the calm authority of a man used to imposing order on chaos. "The law requires that any stray be brought to the county shelter for a mandatory holding period to check for owners and assess its temperament. Charles can do that at his facility." "No," Bruce said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the limestone bedrock beneath their feet. That single word was the final pressure on a crack that had been widening for years. Charles's carefully maintained composure shattered. He turned away from Bruce, his gaze pleading with the sheriff, his voice breaking with a decade of suppressed pain. "You see?" he implored, his hands gesturing helplessly. "You see what I'm talking about? It's an unreasonable attachment to an unknown animal. You don't understand, Brad. You don't know what it's like." His voice grew thick with emotion. "My son, Henry, he was 6 years old. We had a stray show up in our yard, a beautiful German shepherd just like that one. Looked friendly. Henry? He loves dogs. He went out to say hello, to pet it." Charles choked on the memory, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The dog snapped. No warning, no reason, it went for his face. I heard the scream. I'll hear that scream for the rest of my life. He took a ragged breath, looking out at the canyon as if seeing a ghost from his own past. 27 stitches. The doctors did a wonderful job, but the scar, it's still there. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is the fear. My boy, who loved every living creature, became terrified of all dogs. He has nightmares. He flinches when a neighbor's poodle barks. That one dog, in 1 second, stole something from my son that I can never give back. He finally turned back, his gaze landing on Bruce, but his words were for the sheriff. "So when I see that dog, Brad, I don't see a rescue. I don't see a hero. I see a weapon, and I see a good man who doesn't believe it's loaded. I filed that complaint to protect the next 6-year-old from having his life changed forever. I did it because no one was there to protect my Henry." Emotionally spent, Charles simply nodded once to the sheriff, turned without another word to Bruce, and walked back to his truck. The engine started, and the green pickup drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. For a long moment, neither Bruce nor Sheriff Brad spoke. The afternoon sun beat down on them. Finally, Brad broke the silence, his voice much softer now. "I was on duty that day," he said quietly. "I remember the call. He's a good man, Bruce. That pain? It changed him." Bruce stared at the ground, his hand resting on Ghost's neck. He understood pain. He understood being changed by it. And in that moment, he realized that arguing, that being defensive, was not the answer. The sheriff didn't need another argument. He needed to understand. "He's not a stray," Bruce said, his voice low and rough. He looked up and met the sheriff's gaze. "I don't know where he came from, but I know what he is. He's trained. He follows commands a civilian wouldn't know. He's disciplined. The way he handled that snake, that wasn't instinct. That was a drill." Brad listened patiently, his expression giving nothing away. "When I was in the Marines," Bruce began, the words coming hesitantly, as if being pulled from a great depth. "My best friend was a canine handler, Corporal Vincent Hayes. His partner was a shepherd named Rex." He took a breath, the names tasting like rust in his mouth. There was nothing like them, the bond they had. Rex would have walked through fire for Vincent. And Vincent, he loved that dog more than anything. They were one soul in two bodies. This was the first time he had spoken of them to anyone from his civilian life. "We were in Afghanistan, 10 years ago, 2015. We were on patrol in the Korangal. I was sergeant. It was my command." The guilt was a physical thing, twisting his insides. "I made a bad call. We walked into an ambush. Vince, he was hit first. He went down and Rex stood over him, trying to protect him, trying to fight off the world. I was pinned down. I couldn't get to them. I watched it happen." He stopped, his throat closing around the words. Ghost, sensing his distress, leaned heavily against his leg, a silent, solid support. "I failed them, Sheriff," Bruce whispered, the confession finally escaping its prison. "My job was to bring my men home. I failed. And when I look at this dog," he said, his hand tightening in ghost fur, "I see Rex. I see a soldier left behind on the battlefield. Saving him, it wasn't just about pulling a dog off a cliff. It was a chance to finally do something right. He's not just a dog to me. He's a connection to the man I was, to the friend I lost. He's a chance to fix something that's been broken in me for a very long time." Sheriff Brad stood in the quiet of the Texas afternoon, having just become the keeper of two profound and painful secrets. He saw the whole tragic picture now. Two good men, haunted by different ghosts, their pasts colliding over the fate of a single, silent animal. This was no longer about a simple bylaw. This was about trauma, grief, and the desperate human search for redemption. He let out a long, slow breath. "Bruce," he said, his voice full of a weary compassion, "I believe you, every word, but Charles filed a legal complaint. My duty is to the law. The law says an unregistered animal with no clear owner has to be secured and identified." Bruce's face fell. He had bared his soul, and it wasn't enough. "But," the sheriff continued, holding up a hand, "the law can also be patient." He looked Bruce square in the eye. "I'm not taking your dog today. I'm giving you a chance to make this right. You have 72 hours, 3 days. That's how long I can hold off on executing the order." He took a step closer, his voice firm. "In that time, you need to find me something concrete, something I can put in a report, proof of ownership, a registry, a military tattoo, a microchip, anything that proves where this dog came from and confirms he is what you say he is. You give me that, and I can justify closing this case. If you can't, my hands will be tied. I'll have to come back, and I'll have to take him. Do you understand?" Bruce looked down at Ghost, who looked back up at him, his amber eyes full of unwavering trust. 3 days. It was an impossible task, but it was also a sliver of hope. "Yes, Sheriff," Bruce said, his voice clear and steady. "I understand." The 72-hour deadline felt like a physical weight on Bruce's shoulders. With every tick of the clock, the window to save Ghost was closing. There was only one real chance, one path forward that didn't end with an empty space on his living room floor. The next morning, he drove his truck back into Havenwood, not with the crushing anxiety of his last trip, but with the grim determination of a man on a critical mission. Ghost sat in the passenger seat, his head held high, looking out the window with a calm curiosity, completely unaware of the stakes. The Havenwood Veterinary Clinic was a low, modern building, a clean and quiet oasis on the edge of town. Bruce opened the door, and they were met with the clean, antiseptic smell of a place dedicated to healing. A young woman at the front desk looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the magnificent German Shepherd. "We have an appointment," Bruce said, his voice steady. "For a stray I found. I need to see Dr. Christina." A few minutes later, they were shown into an examination room. Dr. Christina entered shortly after. She was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail at once. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved with an air of compassionate competence that immediately put Bruce at ease. "Well now, who is this handsome fellow?" she asked, her voice warm as she knelt down, not reaching for the dog, but letting him approach her first. Ghost, after a brief obligatory sniff, gave her hand a polite lick. "He's a stray I pulled out of the canyon after the flood," Bruce explained, getting straight to the point. He laid out the situation, the complaint filed by Mr. Charles, Sheriff Brad's ultimatum, and the ticking clock. "I have until Friday morning to prove he's not some dangerous, undocumented animal. My only real hope is that he has a microchip." Dr. Christina's expression became serious. She nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "A dog with his temperament," she said, looking at Ghost's calm demeanor, "is rarely a true stray. Let's see what we can find." She returned with a handheld scanner. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioner. Bruce held his breath as Dr. Christina passed the scanner slowly over Ghost's broad shoulders. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Bruce's heart sank, and then the machine let out a loud, sharp beep. Hope, bright and overwhelming, surged through Bruce. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A chip. It was the proof he needed. "Thank God," he whispered. "We've got a number," Dr. Christina confirmed with a smile. "Let's see who he belongs to." She walked over to the computer in the corner of the room and typed in the long string of digits. Bruce watched the screen, his anxiety replaced with a profound sense of relief. This was it. The fight was over. But the relief was short-lived. As Dr. Christina read the information on the screen, her smile faded, replaced by a deep frown of concern. She turned back to Bruce, her expression full of sympathy. "I have bad news and worse news," she said gently. "The good news is the chip is registered. The bad news is the data is corrupted. I have a name, a family, but the address is listed as pending update, and the phone number is out of service." She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Given the timing, it's almost certain their home was hit by the flood. The family could be displaced in a shelter anywhere. We have no way to contact them." The hope that had soared just moments before crashed back to earth. A name on a screen was useless. He was at a dead end, with the clock still ticking. Defeat, cold and bitter, settled in his stomach. He had failed. He looked at Ghost, who was watching him with those trusting amber eyes, and felt a fresh wave of despair. "So that's it, then," Bruce said, his voice hollow. "There's nothing else we can do." Dr. Christina looked from Bruce's crestfallen face to the calm, dignified dog. Something didn't add up. "Don't give up just yet," she said, her professional curiosity piqued. "A dog this well-behaved with that kind of discipline, he feels different. Let me give him a full physical exam. Sometimes you find things the scanner misses. Old scars, unique identifiers. Let's be thorough. Bruce could only nod, a flicker of his earlier hope rekindling. He watched as Dr. Christina began her examination. She checked Ghost's teeth, estimating his age. She palpated his abdomen and felt along his spine, checking for old injuries. She flexed his joints, paying special attention to the leg he favored. Through it all, Ghost stood as still as a statue, a model of patience and tolerance. It was when she moved to his ears, checking for any signs of mites or infection, that she paused. She gently folded back his left ear, her fingers brushing against the soft skin inside. Her frown deepened, but this time it was one of intense concentration. "What is it?" Bruce asked, his voice tense. "Bring that light over here for me, would you?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the dog's ear. Bruce moved the examination lamp closer. In the bright, focused beam, he could see what had caught her attention. There, on the inner flap of Ghost's ear, was a faded, blue-green marking. It was blurred with age, almost illegible, but it was undeniably a tattoo. Dr. Christina's eyes lit up with a flash of recognition. "I knew it," she whispered, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "I've seen this before, years ago, on dogs that came from the MWD program at Lackland Air Force Base." "MWD?" Bruce asked, his heart beginning to pound again. "Military working dog?" "Exactly," she said, her excitement growing. "It's a dual identification system. They have the chip, but they also have the tattoo as a permanent backup. This number, this is our key." The atmosphere in the room was electric. The feeling of defeat had vanished, replaced by a frantic, thrilling sense of discovery. Dr. Christina hurried back to the computer. "The public database is a dead end," she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "But the MWD registry is different. If I can cross-reference the chip ID with this tattoo number." She logged into a secure portal, a database not accessible to the public. She entered the long number from the microchip, then carefully typed in the faded digits from the tattoo. For a tense moment, the screen just showed a loading icon. Bruce felt like his entire future, and Ghost's, was held in that spinning circle. Then the search resolved. A file appeared on the screen, complete with a photograph. It was Ghost, younger, his coat darker, his expression sharp and focused, standing beside a handler in uniform. Dr. Christina read the information aloud, her voice filled with a quiet awe. Name, Valor, identification number, M488. Breed, German Shepherd. Status, honorably retired, military working dog. Served 2 tours of duty, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The words hit Bruce with the force of a physical blow. Valor, a soldier, a hero. His gut instinct, his feeling of a shared history. It wasn't just his own grief talking. It was real. He stared at the dog, his dog, who was patiently watching him, and saw him with entirely new eyes. He was not Ghost, a phantom of the past. He was Valor, a testament to courage and service. "He's a combat veteran," Bruce whispered, a wave of overwhelming pride and a profound, bone-deep connection washing over him. He knelt in front of the dog and looked into his amber eyes. "Valor," he said, testing the name. The dog's ears swiveled forward, and for the first time, his tail gave a full, sweeping wag. Bruce had the proof. He had the truth. He had found his comrade. The night before, long after the rest of Havenwood had gone to sleep, a single light burned in the small office of the animal rescue. Mr. Charles sat at his desk, the official report from Sheriff Brad lying open before him. The words on the page were clear and undeniable, but it was the photograph clipped to the file that held his gaze. A younger, proud German Shepherd in a military harness. Valor? A hero. He looked away from the report and to a small silver frame on the corner of his desk. In it, a 6-year-old boy with a gap-toothed, fearless grin beamed at the camera. Henry, before the accident, before the fear. Charles felt a wave of shame so profound it made him feel sick. He, who had dedicated his life to protecting the innocent, had nearly condemned 2 veterans, one human, one canine, because he had been blinded by the ghosts of his own past. He had seen a monster where there was only a hero. He had projected his own pain onto a man who was carrying a burden far heavier than his own. The silence of the office was a heavy judgment, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that apologies would not be enough. He had to make it right. News of Valor's true identity spread through Havenwood with the speed of a prairie fire. The story was told with awe in the diner, with respect at the feed store, and with a quiet pride at the sheriff's office. The narrative had shifted. Bruce Bennett was no longer the town recluse with a dangerous stray. He was a quiet hero who had rescued a fellow soldier. The town, which had held him at a cautious distance, now looked upon him with a newfound, profound respect. The next afternoon, Bruce was sitting on his porch, watching Valor doze in the sun, when he saw the faded green pickup truck approaching again. This time, however, the dread he had felt before was absent. As the truck stopped, he saw that Mr. Charles was not alone. In the passenger seat was a young boy. Charles got out of the truck, his movements slow, his shoulders slumped. The boy, who looked to be about 10 years old, got out after him, staying close to his father's side. He was a small, quiet boy with his father's kind eyes. On his left cheek, running from just below his eye to the corner of his mouth, was a thin, silvery scar, a permanent memento of his childhood terror. This was Henry. Bruce stood up but didn't move from the porch. Valor lifted his head, his ears perked, but he remained lying down, sensing no threat. Charles and Henry stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The older man took off his hat, holding it in both hands. "Bruce," he began, his voice thick with humility. "I came here to say I'm sorry. I was wrong. I let my own story get in the way of the truth. What you did, saving him, and what he is. Well, there are no words. I'm just truly sorry for the trouble I caused you." "Chill." Bruce looked past the father and at the son, who was peeking at Valor from behind his father's legs, his expression a mixture of intense fear and an equally intense curiosity. Bruce understood. This apology wasn't just for him. "Heard you had a rough time with a shepherd a while back," Bruce said gently, speaking to Henry. The boy flinched and ducked further behind his father. "It's all right, son," Charles said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Bruce slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself down to the boy's level. "His name is Valor," he said, his voice soft. "He was a soldier, just like me. He was trained to protect people, not to hurt them." He gave a quiet command. "Valor, down." The dog immediately lowered his head onto his paws, his body relaxed, his gaze soft and patient. "See?" Bruce said to Henry. "He's a good boy. He was just lost and scared, like you were." Henry took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide. He looked at the powerful animal, then at the faint scar on his own father's soul, and then at the quiet, gentle man kneeling on the porch. He saw no monsters here. Can I touch him?" Henry whispered, the words barely audible. "Of course you can," Bruce said. "Come on up." Henry walked slowly up the steps, his father right behind him. Bruce put his own hand on Valor's broad head, stroking his fur. "He likes it when you scratch behind his ears." He looked at Henry's trembling hand. "Here, I'll help." Bruce gently took Henry's wrist and guided the boy's small hand toward the dog. The moment his fingers touched the thick, soft fur, Henry gasped. Valor didn't move, but let out a low, happy sigh. Bruce let go of Henry's wrist, and the boy's hand stayed right where it was. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Henry began to pet the dog, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder dawning on his face. The fear that had held him captive for years began to melt away under the warmth of the afternoon sun and the patient stillness of a hero. A small, tentative smile, the first his father had seen in a long, long time, touched his lips. Charles watched, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks, his heart lighter than it had been in years. It was the beginning of a healing he thought was no longer possible. Later that evening, long after Charles and a much happier Henry had gone, Bruce sat in his rocking chair on the porch. The sun was a fiery orange ball sinking below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of purple and rose. Valor lay at his feet, his head resting on Bruce's boot, completely at peace. The silence had returned to the ranch, but it was a different silence now. It was whole. It was calm. Bruce looked down at the noble animal, this fellow veteran who had crashed into his life and pulled him from the wreckage of his own past. He had found a brother. He thought of Vincent, not with the sharp, stabbing pain of guilt, but with a quiet, bittersweet ache of love and memory. He could almost feel his friend standing beside him, smiling that easy smile. He put his hand on Valor's head, the bond between them as solid and real as the wood beneath his feet. He closed his eyes, and a single, silent tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "We did it, Vince," he thought, the words a quiet prayer sent out into the twilight. We finally brought a comrade home. A sense of purpose, clear and bright, settled over him. His war was not over. A new mission was just beginning. He pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his face in the gathering dark. He opened the web browser and typed in the name of the organization Dr. Christina had found, the one that tracked retired military working dogs. He scrolled through the pages, reading about their programs, their mission to find homes for these four-legged heroes. He found a link that said, "Start a local chapter." His finger hovered over the screen. He looked at Valor, then out at the vast, quiet landscape of Texas. He was no longer hiding from the world. He was ready to rejoin it. He had a duty to the others like him, and the others like Valor, who were lost and needed a lifeline. He pressed the link. His new life was just beginning. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one can see, and the greatest healing begins with a single act of trust. Bruce and Valor's story reminds us that even after the darkest storm, a new dawn is possible when we find the courage to save another, and in doing so, save ourselves. These are the kinds of tales we are honored to bring to you, stories of loyalty and second chances that connect us all. If their journey touched your heart, help us share more of them by leaving a like and sharing this story with someone who understands that unbreakable bond. Let us know in the comments what Valor's courage meant to you, and to continue the journey, please subscribe and click on the next story waiting for you on the screen.